Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley, and if you're new here, we like to talk about stuff like the paranormal, unsolved mysteries, and of course, true crime. Also, just sending you guys a quick reminder that I also now have a TikTok, same username at HeebeeJeebeezTV, and on there I share a lot more short stories, of course, both paranormal and true crime. Most of the stories are between 2 and 3 minutes, and most of them are stories that I've never told on YouTube, and I do have some shorter recap versions on there of videos on here. Now, before we get into today's video, of course, sending you guys another quick reminder to please comment, like, subscribe if you enjoy this type of content. Really trying to get to 1,000 subscribers on here, so I would be extremely grateful if you guys were able to help me do that. All right, so today's video is quite, I guess, traumatic. It is very disturbing. So if you are sensitive towards crimes against young children, then click out and just join me on the next video. All right, so today we're going to talk about a woman named Theresa Knorr, who has been dubbed the worst mother ever. And when we get into the story, you'll fully understand why. As I was reading through this case, I was extremely disturbed at the sort of crimes this woman committed on her own children. And it's just something that a lot of us would never imagine being capable of doing. And the part that upset me the most is that she could have been stopped multiple times. And it's just another sad story about how the system has failed. But of course, to understand what happened, we need to go back to the beginning of Theresa's story. And this is in no way justifying what she did. This is just trying to get a little bit more context into what led up to these events. All right, so let's get started. So Theresa was born on March 14th, 1946 in Sacramento, California. Unfortunately, her father was abusive, and this sort of behavior really just intensified when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And because it was such a debilitating disease, he ended up taking out his aggression on his family. Essentially, this meant that Theresa's mother had to become the sole breadwinner, and Theresa wasn't their only child. She also had 2 other children, so it's safe to say that this would have been incredibly stressful and a very toxic environment to be in, especially as a young child. Sadly for Theresa, in 1961, her mother ended up dying unexpectedly, which meant that the family no longer had any money to support the household or any income for themselves, really. And Theresa was said to have taken this very, very hard. It affected her a lot. And so since the family could no longer afford the house, the father was forced to sell it. The following year, in 1962, when Theresa was only 16 years old, she decided to run away from home, and she ended up dating this guy called Clifford Sanders. Clifford was 5 years older than her, so she was 16 and he would have been 21. And just a few months after meeting each other, they ended up getting married. Then she drops out of high school, focuses on creating a family with Clifford, gets pregnant right away, and then she ends up giving birth to her first child in 1963 and names him Howard. However, her relationship with Howard was anything but blissful. It was supposedly very, very toxic. There was a lot of jealousy coming from Theresa's part. She was very controlling. She was manipulative. She constantly thought that Clifford was cheating on her, so she would accuse him all the time, and then this would lead to really, really big fights. Clifford was no angel, though. He did his fair share of abuse in the relationship, to the point where it was said that he struck her in the face multiple times in the middle of these heated arguments. Then July 6, 1964 comes around, and at this point, Theresa is pregnant with their second child. And Theresa had started accusing Clifford of cheating her once again. And obviously this led to a very, very big fight. And it was so bad that Clifford made the decision to leave Theresa. Obviously, she was not going to take this lying down. She was not happy about this at all. So when Clifford was literally walking out the door to leave Theresa, she takes her rifle, shoots him in the back, and the bullet goes straight through his heart, which ends up killing him instantly. Normally, you would think something like this would bring the story to an end. What she did was murder, but Theresa had a backup plan. when it came time to go to court, she claimed self-defense, saying that she was a battered wife, that Clifford was extremely abusive and an alcoholic. And surprisingly, the court ended up believing her. She was acquitted and essentially was let go without any repercussions. And this was extremely frustrating towards Clifford's family and even Theresa's own sister. Clifford's family claimed that they never saw him be abusive towards anyone. And Theresa's sister also claimed that she knew Theresa had a history of being extremely jealous, controlling, angry, manipulative, and that she wouldn't put it past her being capable of committing a crime like this. So after the entire ordeal with Clifford's death, Theresa ends up giving birth to her second child, and this time it's a girl, and she names her Sheila. However, now as a mother of two, you would think that she would have a little bit more of a responsible nature. She would try to be a little bit more of a doting mother, but in fact, she ended up being the exact opposite. She was spotted frequenting a lot of bars. She was out drinking a lot. She was out dating. And eventually this actually did end up leading to her second marriage. Her next husband was named Robert Knorr, and they ended up getting married on July 6, 1966. And together they had 4 more children, almost one right after the other. Susan was born in 1966. William was born in 1967, Robert Jr. was born in 1968, and Terry, aka Theresa Jr., was born in 1970. Robert was also kind enough to adopt Theresa's 2 older children from her previous marriage, and everyone ended up adopting the last name Knorr. However, as you can imagine, it didn't take long for Theresa to go back to her old ways. She almost immediately started accusing Robert of cheating on her. She became extremely manipulative, controlling. She was quite angry. There was a lot of fights, and Robert just wasn't having it. He wasn't going to take it. So he decided to also leave Theresa, but he had made it known to her that he wanted to be part of their children's lives. But because Theresa was so angry and out of spite, she told him that she wanted nothing to do with him and that he could no longer see his children. So after her second divorce in 1970, Theresa goes back to the dating scene. She starts going to bars, she's drinking heavily again, she's smoking, and eventually this does lead to 2 more marriages, but I'm sure, as you can guess by now, both of these marriages didn't last and both ended up getting divorces. This final 4th divorce was said to have sent Theresa down a very deep, dark hole, which heavily affected her mental health. As she was struggling with her mental health, she started gaining quite a lot of weight. She was no longer taking care of herself. She became very paranoid, and she actually started having delusional experiences. And because of her paranoia, she ended up pulling all of her kids out of school, confined them to the house. She wouldn't let them have friends. She wouldn't let them go outside to play. And at one point, she ended up cutting the phone service to their house. Sadly, though, that was just the beginning of the nightmare that was to come for these children. Theresa had only shown a very small side of how dark and controlling and evil she could actually be. Of course, I'm sure her paranoia didn't help, but it doesn't excuse what happened. She started accusing all of her children of doing things they hadn't done, and when these little kids had no idea what she was talking about or wouldn't confess to these alleged crimes, she would get extremely angry and she would start beating them. And at one point, she was said to have ordered the older children to hold down the younger children so she could get a better beating in. But that wasn't it. She was also said to have burned them with cigarettes. She continued to beat them with whatever she could find. When she would let them go outside, she would make them do hard labor work in the scorching heat. She would also play this game where she would throw knives at them. And at one point, it was also said that she locked Terry, Theresa Jr., inside of a chest freezer. Now, from what I was able to find online, the family did live in an apartment complex, so they did have neighbors, which makes me curious as to why no one really said anything, because the neighbors, when they were later asked, They said they did notice that the kids stopped going outside, that they could hear weird noises sometimes, and the most prominent thing is that the house smelled like urine, but no one bothered reporting this to the police. So with Theresa basically able to do whatever she wanted to her children, she decided to focus her attention on Sheila and Susan, her two oldest daughters. She was said to have become quite jealous that her two daughters were starting to mature and blossom into young, beautiful women. And she ended up accusing both of them of being witches and casting a spell on her that ended up making her gain weight and started making her lose her looks. So in retaliation, she decided to focus on Susan and started force feeding her so she would also gain weight. And she wouldn't just give her a lot of food. She would go out of her way to make really, really caloric, dense macaroni and cheese. And the way she would do this was to add a bunch of extra lard into the pot of mac and cheese. And then she would force Susan to eat all of it. And if Susan was too full to eat it, she would take a spoon and shove it down her throat, basically. And when Susan was too full or she would throw up because she just couldn't do it anymore, Theresa would then make Susan eat her own vomit. Then miraculously, one day, Susan manages to escape the house, and it's not really clear how she was able to get in touch with authorities. Some people say that she had gotten arrested. Some say that she was just picked up on the street because she was still a teenager, and so police were concerned about why she was just alone on the streets. Some people say that she purposely went to seek out the police to tell them what was going on. Regardless of what happened, the police did hear about what was happening at Susan's home with her mother, so they decided to go pay the mother a visit along with a caseworker. So they bring Susan with them to the house and they start talking to Theresa. And right away, Theresa is on guard. She puts up all her defenses and starts just denying everything. Deny till you die. So the police start asking the rest of the children, is this true? Is your mother hurting you guys? And all the other children all backed up their mother's story. And it's speculated that they did this because they were just afraid of what would happen if they actually told the truth. So without any solid evidence to arrest Theresa or to believe Susan's story, the police and the caseworker had no choice but to return Susan to her mother's care and leave the house. As you can imagine, this pissed off Theresa so much, and she decided to take it all out on Susan and just make things so much harder for her. Now, instead of just force feeding Susan, Theresa decided to handcuff her daughter to the dining room table. Now, this is where she would basically spend the next 2 years of her life being force-fed and beaten. But it wasn't just Theresa that was doing all of the damage. At this point, she had ordered her two sons, Robert and William, to also participate in the abuse towards the rest of the children. It's not really fully understood how Howard was able to leave the house, but at this point, he was no longer living with the family and had gone off on his own. It's also not fully understood why Howard didn't send for help if he was able to escape. He was a few years older than Susan, so I imagine he would have been at least 18 years old. He could have easily sent for help, but it's just one of those questions that we're never going to get an answer to. Now, what happens next is also heavily debated, and there are two stories. So the first version comes from Robert Jr.'s perspective. And he said that Theresa, their mother, had given Terry Jr. a gun to hold and stand guard and watch over Susan while she was out doing something else. At this point, something was said to have startled Terry, and it scared her to the point where she accidentally pulled the trigger and ended up shooting Susan in the stomach. The second version of the story comes from Terry Jr., and she says that it was her mother that purposely shot Susan in the stomach. Regardless of which version is true, Susan did get shot and she was not in good condition. So of course, Theresa wasn't about to call 911. She wasn't about to go get help for her daughter. Instead, she orders Robert and William to carry her from the dining room table and to put her into the bathroom inside the bathtub. Theresa basically expected her daughter to die there, But to her surprise, Susan ended up surviving. She started healing a little bit by herself, and when Theresa noticed this, she was said to have also helped her in her healing. Thankfully, Susan did recover and she was able to start moving and walking around again. But as soon as she was able to do that, Theresa went back to handcuffing her to the dining room table. At this point, as you can imagine, Susan just had it. She had no more energy in her to keep doing this. So she started begging her mother to please let her go, that she would do anything, that she wouldn't tell anyone. All that she wanted at this point was to be free. And after begging enough, her mother ended up giving in and agreed to let her go. However, there was one condition. Theresa wanted to make sure that she was able to remove the bullet that was still stuck inside of Susan's back. It had entered her stomach and gotten lodged in the back. So Theresa didn't want any evidence out there of what she was doing to her children in case Susan went out and told anyone. So with that condition, Susan agreed simply because she was so desperate to leave. So the family starts prepping for an at-home surgery. It was said that they gave Susan some whiskey and some antipsychotic drugs that belonged to Theresa, and eventually she passed out on the kitchen floor. Theresa then orders her youngest daughter, Terry, to basically be her surgeon's assistant, and using an X-Acto knife, they start cutting into Terry's back to start looking for the bullet. Surprisingly, they did end up finding the bullet, and when they did find it, they flushed it down the toilet. But because they were using tools that were not sterile, it was a very dirty environment, and they just didn't have any of the appropriate resources to do anything remotely like this at home. Susan ended up getting very, very ill. I'm sure you can all imagine the pain that comes from doing a surgery like this at home. And when Susan woke up, she was said to have been in excruciating pain. But Theresa, not having any actual medication for her, all she did was give her some Advil and ignored her. Because the pain was so bad, Susan did end up losing consciousness, and this led her to slipping into a coma. And as a result of this coma, Susan then started losing control of her bodily functions, including her capability of using the bathroom. So it was said that she would end up urinating on the floor, and this would piss off Susan. So all she ended up doing was putting on diapers on Susan and then just literally left her on the floor. And the children remember having to just walk over her body to do anything in the kitchen, and they quite literally just left their sister there to die. Eventually, Susan ended up turning yellow, and this was because of jaundice and sepsis. But Theresa had another explanation. She was convinced that her daughter had been possessed by a demon, and that the only way to save her at this point was with fire. Then on July 16th, 1984, with Susan on the verge of death, Theresa orders her two sons, Robert and William, to put her in the trunk along with all of her belongings, including the diapers. And all four of them, Theresa, Robert, William, and Susan, end up driving out to the middle of absolutely nowhere, and they end up dumping Susan's body. They then pour gasoline over Susan's body and all of her belongings, set it on fire, and then they leave. Now, with Susan out of the picture, Theresa had only one other person to put all her anger towards, and that was her other daughter, Sheila. Almost immediately, she started doing the same thing. She started by forcing Sheila into sex work, and then she also started force feeding her as well. Now, because she had forced Sheila into sex work, one day she ended up accusing her of having a venereal disease and that she had contaminated the toilet seat, which then caused Theresa to get this disease as well. Of course, there was no actual disease. Sheila had absolutely no idea what her mother was talking about, so she never admitted to doing this, but that wasn't enough for Theresa. In retaliation to this, Theresa ends up doing the same thing she did to Susan. She takes Sheila, handcuffs her to the dining table, and then forbids her from using the bathroom. Now, with Sheila in an extremely vulnerable position being chained to the dining room table, Theresa takes advantage of this and just starts abusing her, starts beating her. She gets her two sons to continue participating in the abuse in order to get Sheila to confess about the disease. But Sheila stands her ground. She doesn't admit to anything. And so, realizing that this just wasn't going to work, Theresa takes Sheila, ties her up, and then locks her inside of a broom closet. She would then leave Sheila inside this closet for about 3 weeks, and she had absolutely no food, no water. And it was said that the rest of the children, including Theresa, could hear Sheila's screams, but they just ignored it. And whenever it would get too loud or annoying for Theresa, she was said to have just turned up the volume on the TV. Again, I'm not sure why any of the neighbors weren't able to hear these screams, or if they did, why no one said anything about this. Little Terry, though, had a big heart, and she did try to help her sister. She tried bringing her water multiple times, but Theresa would always catch her. And unfortunately, that would be the closest Sheila would ever get to surviving. Then on June 21st, 1985, the screams finally stopped. The house was silent and the entire family just heard this big thud noise. What that was Sheila's body quite literally dropping dead. And it took 3 entire days for Theresa to finally open the closet door. And when she did, Sheila's body falls out and there is a very disgusting odor of her body decomposing that literally engulfs the entire apartment. Obviously, Theresa realizes that she can't keep Sheila's body in the apartment anymore, so she orders Robert and William to take care of it. So the 2 boys wrap Sheila's body in some sheets, then they stuff her into the trunk of the car, and then together with their mother, they drive off again to the middle of nowhere to a different location from where Susan's body was dumped. So they arrive to their destination, and just as they're about to take Sheila's body out of the trunk, a police officer pulls up behind them, finding their behavior a little bit suspicious. What are you guys doing in a remote area? And the family tells them that the 2 boys just had to use the bathroom, so they decided to stop for a quick bathroom break and that they would be on their way. The police officer, finding this excuse reasonable, I guess, tells them, okay, no problem, just do your business, but you guys got to get out of here. So with that, the family gets back into the car and they drive off somewhere else. They then drive further north to a place called Martise Creek Lake, and that's where they ended up dumping Sheila's body. They didn't bother to set it on fire this time because they just didn't want to risk getting caught. After Sheila's death, the apartment smelled like decomposing flesh, and this made Theresa very, very paranoid, to the point where she knew that the family just couldn't stay there anymore because she had a feeling that someone would finally say something. So on September 29th, 1986, Theresa moves the family out of the apartment and orders little Terry to set the apartment on fire in hopes that it would destroy all of the evidence. So Theresa, still being kind of young, she agrees. So she goes and pours gasoline all over the house, ends up setting it on fire. Fortunately, the neighbors did notice this, so they were able to call 911. The fire was put out before anything could really be destroyed. In exchange for having set the apartment on fire, Terry was said to have negotiated a deal with her mother in order to let her go. So at this point, Terry was no longer living with her mother. She turned to basically living on the streets because at that point, anything was better than living with her mom. Sadly, though, Terry was struggling with a lot of mental health issues. She was also struggling with a lot of addiction problems as well, and this would lead her to getting into trouble and eventually arrested multiple times. When she would get arrested, she would start talking and telling basically anyone that would listen about what had happened to her sisters, what her mother had done to the entire family. But police officers literally just ignored Terry because they thought that she was quote unquote crazy, that everything she was saying was just part of her mental health issues, and essentially just completely brushed it off. It wasn't until Terry was able to get into contact with the Placer County Sheriff's Department, which is just north of Sacramento, that someone finally believed her. What Terry was telling them matched up with the body of a certain Jane Doe that the sheriff department had found. And this all made a lot of sense. It all added up, especially when the police had found diapers that were next to Susan's body. They didn't fully understand why these items were next to this burnt body, but after Terry's story, it all made sense. Finally, in November of 1993, police issued arrest warrants for Theresa, but also for her two sons, Robert and William, for having aided her in getting rid of the bodies and also for the abuse towards the other children. By this point, the two boys were now grown men. Robert was said to have been the only sibling still living with Theresa, and it was said that they were supposedly very, very tight on money, and this pushed Robert to do some dangerous stuff. He had actually gotten into trouble while attempting to rob a bar, and he ended up shooting the bartender and killing him. So basically, at this point, he was in jail, so police knew where to find him. When it came to William, he was living in a different town called Woodland, California. Theresa at this point was basically on the run. She had moved out of Sacramento and had made her way to Salt Lake City, where she had reverted to using her maiden name, and police had actually managed to track her down right before she was about to start running off to who knows where, because when they did find her, she had already had her bags packed. So they bring all of them in for questioning, and the police immediately offer a plea deal to the two sons in exchange for their testimony. Robert was said to have gotten 3 additional years to his current sentence, and William was only given probation in exchange for their stories. So when police finally got to Theresa, they told her that her sons had agreed to testify against her. And when she found out about this, she just decided to plead guilty in order to avoid the death sentence. So on October 17th, 1995, Theresa was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences with chance of parole in 2027 when she would be 81, and if she's still alive at that point. As for the rest of the living children, Robert was released from jail in 2013. William was said to have gone on to live a relatively normal life, having a family and children. Not much is known about Howard. And then Terry Jr., unfortunately, she ended up dying in 2011 from heart failure. Now, there's a bunch of documentaries and short videos on this entire experience. I believe it was even featured on a show on Netflix called Evil Lives Here. And you can see firsthand accounts of the sons talking about their experience. And if I'm able to, I'll put a few short clips in here. But essentially, it's a very, very sad story and just another case of the system failing to protect children. Theresa could have been caught multiple times when she killed her first husband, when Susan escaped. You know, neighbors could have said something, but it's just very, very sad. All right, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Have you ever heard of this story? If you guys have any other case suggestions, whether they're paranormal or true crime, I would love to take a look. And don't forget to check me out on TikTok at HeebeeJeebeezTV for more short stories and summary versions of some of my cases here on YouTube. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you in the next video.